صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله. صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله وأهل بيتك المظلومين. صلى الله عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله الآخر العهد مني لزيادتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. ويا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي ونفوز فوزا عظيما. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. So, as Haider was saying, we'll continue discussing the topic which was initiated yesterday, which is about the Walaya of the Imam, ethics and the pursuit of justice. And one of the things which I tried to mention last night, or this earlier morning, was the idea of the complementarity and the homologies between these, insofar as the walaya of the Imam constituted a certain ilm or knowledge, the ethics constituted a certain type of amal, and justice arose from the complementarity and the mapping of the praxis upon the theory. And so today, what I will talk about more is that third element of this, which of course is justice. And another point which was quite important yesterday, which I'll reiterate, was that the way in which we understood the connection between these three realities, these three things, and the way in which we conveyed what they meant was often through the telling of stories, the construction of narratives, and through literary forms. And it was also very important to understand that often those literary forms were presented in the best of aesthetic forms, quite simply because it was the beauty of, in a sense, the message which attracted and drew people to the actual content and the meaning which was being conveyed. So the narratives were absolutely central to what was being presented. Now today, in terms of the justice element, what I want to do is say a few things about justice and ethics to begin with, and I'll say a few things particularly about some ways in which people in philosophical contexts, modern philosophical contexts, talk about the questions of justice and how they might differ from the virtue ethics context that we've been talking about. And then I will say a few things about how the akhlaq traditions deal with these questions, and how, for example, the question of justice in its various forms as a package of ideas and faculties is presented, for example, in the Quran. And then I will try to bring things together by looking finally at how these questions of justice arise from the narrative that we have about Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and touch briefly upon what the implications of those might be for some of the questions of social justice and the pursuit of justice in the contemporary world as we have it today. So in some ways it's quite an ambitious plan of what I want to do over the next 40 odd minutes, and let's see how it goes. So to begin with, foregrounding with some general notions around justice. So we know that at least since the time of Aristotle, there was the identification of justice as a primary virtue, as something which in a sense binds the whole edifice of ethics and of moral agency together. It's a pivot around which all the other virtues seem to circulate, and it was seen as a virtue which inhered within the soul, and it was pursued so that the person could achieve happiness and success in this life and in the hereafter, and in some and this of course is success both of the mind and the spirit, and that success, the ultimate stage, the ultimate perfection of that success lay in the tradition of understanding wisdom, understanding philosophy, both in Islam and in pre-Islamic contexts, of what is often called theosis, or becoming godlike. And this in particular in the Arabic idiom was expressed by this phrase, "Atashabbu bil bari," striking a similitude to the Creator, and was often expressed in certain hadith, such as "Takhallaqu bi akhlaqillah," which I mentioned yesterday, to acquire the virtues of God, to try and embark upon this path of walaya. I mentioned in the Q&A yesterday that the notion of walaya was one which was modulated and graded all the way from the perfection of it, which lay with the Ahlul Bayt, down to lesser degrees, so much so that every sincere, tested believer could manifest certain elements of walaya themselves. So that's the broad kind of conception of what justice is and how it was pursued. And as I mentioned yesterday, again, this was within a ethical context in which it was about the ontology of the person. It was about the moral psychology of the person as the foundation for the agency that person effected. Now, taking us a bit further into some of the philosophical discussions, the first point perhaps which would be worth mentioning is how justice, and I think it is useful just to use the term adala or adalat to render what was meant by justice in the ancient Greek tradition and beyond, and place it within the other cardinal, what are known as the cardinal virtues, which you find especially already articulated in Aristotle, and was very much part of the traditions of ethics and the language of ethics which developed. And understanding an element of that language and the historical development of the language, as the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre has suggested, is quite significant, because one of the problems sometimes which arises in contemporary discussions of ethics is that if we do not understand how we, in a sense, arrived at these traditions of ethics and the language of ethics, we cannot necessarily understand what the debate is about. So we need to have a sense of what the history is, so we know how we got here and what was being argued and what was at stake. So the four cardinal virtues, which I think in many ways are all aspects of justice, are justice itself, of course, which we might, as I said, call adalat. The other virtues being prudence, which we might render as actually as hilm, this rather interesting Arabic term for a virtue. Temperance, the idea of moderation, of being a mean between two extremes, and the notion of fortitude, steadfastness, even courage, istiqamat, perhaps shuja'at might even be rendered for this. And in many ways, as I'm suggesting, while these are described as four different primary virtues, which are separate, in many ways we can consider these all to be aspects of the sorts of thing that we expect justice to be doing and justice to be presenting. Now, perhaps the one thing which most people understand if you talk about questions of justice, in particular of Aristotle, is the famous notion of the golden rule. And this is very much about the notion that justice is about how we treat one another. I said yesterday that there are various ways in which we can define ethics, but one of the ones which I think is quite significant for lots of the discussions within an Islamic context is the idea that ethics is what we owe one another, which goes to the very heart of how one treats one's fellow person. And that treatment, in a sense, is also stems out of the justice that one effects and does to oneself. So it's an extension of that. And it's an extension of that because one understands that the other is oneself. It's an extension of the self. One encounters and understands the other as yourself. And so what you wish for yourself is, and how you wish to be treated, and the concern and care that you would have for yourself, the sort of the techniques of the self, to use the language that someone like Foucault might have used, or even the ancient Stoics, is something which then also applies to the way in which we treat others. Now, when we come to modern philosophical accounts of ethics, I think there are a couple of assumptions that we need to lay out, which might distinguish it between from some of these ancient Aristotelian ethical norms, and also some of the ways in which ethics are discussed within Islamic contexts. The first of these assumptions, I think, which is important to lay out, is what one might call the liberal notion of the autonomous self. The fundamental idea then being that the self, the ground for moral agency, is autonomous, is unencumbered by others, is capable of making independent judgments, and actually has to do so, should not be hindered, should not be constrained in their liberty to do so. And liberty in this context is very much understood as a negative form of liberty. This is freedom from some sort of constraint, and that autonomous self ultimately can be part of a wider collective, but its agency is understood in and of itself, right? And I think one finds this in many different theories of justice, and one finds this amongst libertarians, those who very much are in favor of this, as I said, this notion of negative liberty. It finds itself amongst utilitarians who really believe that the way in which justice is enacted and resources and values are distributed is very much about the maximization of utility and the greater good. And even with other notions of justice, for example, with John Rawls and others as well. So that's a first assumption which I think is important. The second assumption which is worth mentioning is that justice is not seen necessarily as an abstract, or it might be seen as a result, but it's the fundamental focus is on agency, on action. So the justice relates to the sorts of things that we do, the way in which we distribute social goods, and so forth, how we behave with one another. It's very much an element of things which are enacted. It's not necessarily about your moral psychology or your ontology. Now, out of those two basic assumptions that we have about the nature of justice, as I said, we have various theories. We have notions around the way in which goods, etc., are distributed, the way in which we treat each other. There's some sort of a natural order based on, in a sense, a non-intervention, which leads towards a libertarian notion. More recently, especially exemplified in the work of people like Robert Nozick and others after him. And you have utilitarian ideas from Mill and after. You have John Rawls's idea of justice as fairness, in which there is particular concern for those who are most needy. But what is often the case in all of these contexts is that, first of all, one's not necessarily talking, and one in fact is not talking about divine justice. One is not talking about some sort of cosmic order. One is fundamentally talking about elements of what we might call distributive justice. And so a lot of people who do talk about justice, it often overlaps with legal scholars, people talking about law and fairness and justice in that context, or those who sometimes are talking about political economy. One thinks of Amartya Sen's work on justice, which is very much about distribution of social goods. Now, these sorts of concerns are well and good, but they don't deal with some of the perhaps more fundamental philosophical issues which are at stake beyond distributive justice. And that's in many ways what is then being presented in the narratives and discussions that we have both in the akhlaq tradition and in the sorts of narratives which arise, the reports which arise out of hadith of the Prophet and the Imams, and also within the Quran itself. Now, there's a couple of things I want to say about akhlaq, which I realize I forgot to say yesterday, which I'll mention before I come to some of those elements. I did say something about the term khulq and how it's used, and the idea of khulq as a virtue or characteristic which inheres within the person and the self. One of the important elements of the way in which khulq, from which of course you get the plural akhlaq, is discussed in the akhlaq tradition, is the idea that it is a property or propensity which exists within the soul, from which moral agency arises almost naturally and inexorably without the need for reflection and thought. So the idea there is that you inculcate within yourself a khulq of, say, justice, and justice of course is a khulq, and other akhlaq. And if you have inculcated that within yourself, then automatically it will be the case that good moral action will arise out of that, right? Of course, you can here perhaps raise this whole question of, well, what happens when you don't have this simple complementarity between the ilm and the amal, between the fact that you know certain things which arises out of the akhlaq which are residing in your soul, in yourself, and the fact that you perhaps do not act accordingly. So, this in ancient philosophy, this is known as the problem of akrasia. It goes back at least to Plato, And it's the idea that, why is it that people who seemingly are good and know better still act in bad and immoral and even evil ways? How do we deal with this kind of dissonance? Or in another context, we can even say, how is it that seemingly very intelligent people who are capable of articulating moral ideas can actually behave so badly, treat other people so badly? And as I said, this is known as the problem of akrasia. And this, of course, is discussed extensively in the akhlaq literature and other types of more scriptural literature. And it's often seen as a function of the way in which the different faculties within the soul are kind of fighting each other and are perhaps even in disequilibrium and veil the truths that actually do reside, moral truths which do reside in the soul, from the person, so that they are incapable of acting accordingly. And that's where, for example, you have this notion of diseases of the soul and attempting to cure and to treat those diseases of the soul, so that there is a clearer complementarity, so that there is a mirror which allows action to accurately mirror what one knows in one's soul. So that sort of brings me precisely to, saying what are these four elements of, or these four faculties which are in the soul. And again, the akhlaq literature is very clear on this. It goes back in many ways to Aristotle, and this is the idea that there are four. The four faculties basically are the intellect, the rational soul, if you want, the mind, which is kind of discerning yourself and understanding the world outside of you. Then there is this notion of waham. So waham is an element of our animality. And actually the important thing is that out of these faculties, all of which are considered faculties of the soul, there are certain elements which relate to the fact that we are human, and primary within that, of course, is the intellect. And there are certain elements which arise out of our animality. So those which arise out of our animality are waham, which is kind of an estimation, a quick kind of guess, perhaps, of what the situation is. It's one of the ways in which perhaps sometimes we're a bit hasty in how we make decisions and understand things. A second one is anger. Now, anger, ghadab, is considered to be a very important passion, an important faculty, an important motivator within the soul. But it can, at times, be good, of course. If anger motivates you to act in a righteous manner, for example, to be angry at seeing oppression or seeing something bad being done, which then forces you to act, that can be a good thing. But anger, of course, can also be something which again veils moral truths from yourself, so that you're blinded and then you act in a hasty and a rash manner. And then, of course, once you realize what you've done in that act of passion, then you are sort of repentant and you regret what you might have done. And the final faculty which is there, which again relates to our animality, is what is known as shahwa, what you might call the element of the carnality of the animal self that we are, our desires which relate to the way that we are. So again, that can have good elements of it. So, self-preservation, we need to eat and drink to survive. That comes very much out of our shahwa. But also, it can also lead you into towards vices, because you can become perhaps too attached to things which keep us going. One can become greedy, one can become gluttonous, one can become lustful, and so forth. And so these are the four faculties which are within the soul, according to the Akhlaq tradition. And justice entails, of course, a balance between them, but especially entails that it is the intellect, the aql, which is the commanding force, which kind of holds everything together. Now, I'm going to say a few more things about this, but I want to just quickly skip and to sort of foreground some of these points about how the Akhlaq tradition talks about justice by quickly turning to the Quran. And again, there are many things you can take out from the Quran about the nature of justice, and also the distinction between, say, divine justice and justice as a way in which we deal with one another. But I've just drawn up a few here which I think are quite important. The first is the sort of terminology and language we have for justice. So we have a number of terms which are used in the Quran. There is, of course, the famous word adl, which, of course, theologically becomes very significant. It's one of the usul, so to speak, of the Shia tradition in particular. Adl, as in that context, is primarily concerns divine justice, but the broader notion of justice as something which is a feature of the divine, but also a central feature of the cosmos. And I'll come back to this question of adl this issue of adl as the fundamental feature of the cosmos. Other terms which are used are qist, the idea of a balance, of harmony. There's terms such as mizan and so forth. And various terms which relate to judgment. So the idea, and sort of hakam there, hakama, the root in Arabic, so that doing justice is related to ways in which we make judgments. We make judgments about relationships, about acts and events, and so forth. Now, these are the various kinds of terms we have. And within all of that, a lot of what is presented in these Quranic verses are the two sorts of elements. One is that these things are virtues of character, which relate to a person, but also that they are virtues which have to be enacted through one's agency. And this comes back to this basic complementarity of ilm and amal that I've been talking about, which ultimately again is an expression of this classic phrase which reoccurs in the Quran extensively, which this appeal to alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat, those who have faith or believe and those who do good works. So there's that complementarity that one has between ilm and amal. Another term, another concept which is very much there in terms of the enactment of it, relates to this term of haqq, or right. And here there is this, or even aqd is used, the idea of a due duty that one has. So a lot of the enactment of justice is about rendering the rights that people have, and God, of course, has over you, and you yourself have over you, as well as the duties that you may owe to yourself and to others. There is the further notion that, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, that adl, istiqamat, qist, these are all basic elements of the cosmos. They are there, they just have to be discerned. And so God's acting according to these principles is clear in the fact that this is how the cosmos works. And then if we want to understand our own place within it, we need to be in harmony with that. There are elements of distributive justice, of course, as well. The reason why things like zakat and other types of religious dues are to be levied, the insistence upon using your wealth for the betterment, for the distribution of goods and the welfare of others is very much there as well. There are also kind of otherworldly elements of justice. So justice is not just an element of this particular cosmos and the world and how we treat each other, but also is a feature of the afterlife and how the transition into the afterlife occurs. One of the things I want to mention, I've also already hinted it in the language I've used, is that there's a threefold practice, in a sense, of justice, which is being presented in the Quran. The first one is being just to yourself. And this is precisely why the Quran talks about not doing justice or doing injustice to yourself, the idea of dhalama nafs, right? Being aware of your own dignity as a human and what that entails, and then being just to what you ought to be and how God has created you to be in harmony with this wider cosmic order of justice. So that's the first one, justice to yourself. The second one, of course, is justice to God, which is about rendering the dues of God and enacting what I mentioned yesterday, this theological principle of shukr al-mun'am, of thanking the benefactor. Of course, this is not a phrase which explicitly comes up in the Quran, but there, of course, is the phrase which I mentioned yesterday of the constant choice that one has to either be someone who is shakir or be someone who is kafir, either be grateful or to be ungrateful. And the third element of the enacting of justice is the way in which we treat each other and how we do justice to others, which is there very much centrally in the Quranic ayat that we have. Now, as I mentioned, we can then see how these are then developed and play out in the akhlaq tradition. Now, the akhlaq tradition usually does this in two ways. In a more kind of abstract way of trying to develop certain principles and philosophical accounts for how we talk about these things. And it does it also in a much more practical kind of homiletic way. If I take the first, this is very much about the philosophical elements of it, to talk about justice as being the harmony between what the practical intellect motivates one and judges, and what the theoretical intellect judges, right? So theoretical intellect relates to issues around metaphysics, so how things are. So if we understand how things truly are, kama hiya, as the phrase is, or in light of the famous prophetic prayer, Allahumma arina al-ashya kama hiya, then that forms the basis for how things ought to be and how we should act to make that come about. The second point I would make is one which I've mentioned briefly before, is that within the four faculties within the soul, you want to make sure that it's the intellect which dominates and which controls and ensures that there is a correct kind of balance and harmony in the other three, so that there is a control and dominance over anger passion, desire, over kind of this sort of knee-jerk reaction, initial guessing of wahm. And that there is a philosophical account given for why it is that there should be the pursuit of the mean, which I've briefly alluded to before. It goes back at least to Aristotle. And but also recognition, as I said, both of the problem of akrasia, which I've mentioned, as well as the problem necessarily of how we determine what the mean is. And one of the ways in which, for example, Jami as-Sa'ada mentions how we can understand the difficulty of arriving at the mean is by considering the famous hadith, which talks about the nature of as-Sirat al-Mustaqim, of the straight path, as being one which is thinner than a hair and sharper than a sword. So that is then considered to be a feature also of the difficulty, in a sense, of arriving at understanding the mean. And as I mentioned, there are also extensive discussions about how we then deal with those diseases of the heart, deal with those imbalances of the three animalistic faculties, which are motivators, but also with disequilibrium which might exist in the intellect. So, for example, things like arrogance, being haughty, being very much self-concerned and self-centered, in many ways is the sort of disease which arises out of the intellect. It's not necessarily about the animality of it, it's about the intellect. And it's a certain element actually of jahl. Jahl, ignorance, is the fundamental kind of disease of the intellect. And within jahl, what is even worse is, of course, what the tradition calls jahl murakkab. And jahl murakkab, or composite jahl, is where it's not just that you're ignorant, but you're also arrogant enough to think that you know everything, and you don't even know that you are in a situation of jahl, right? So what is often said with most of these diseases, but especially with the diseases of the heart which relate to the intellect, is that there has to be a first step recognition that there is a problem. There is and it's from the recognition of the problem that you can then proceed. Now, so far so abstract, so to speak. The other element of the akhlaq tradition, and you find this already in the Akhlaq-i-Nasiri of Nasiruddin Tusi and others, after him who write works on his model, is then to refer back to what I've mentioned today, but also discussed more yesterday, which is the use of narrative, telling stories so that people understand what these things actually mean. What does it mean to control your anger? What does it mean to really discern how it is that you're acting and how you're acting? Everyone is familiar with the famous story of Amir al-Mu'mineen in the battle, where he has overpowered his opponent. His opponent spits in his face and he steps away, right? This is also, of course, famously enacted in the Masnavi of Maulana as well. And that's very much the idea of not allowing the animality to take over and to motivate how you act. Because if you're fighting someone, if you're ultimately killing someone, that is a moral act. And you want to make sure that that act is a good moral act as opposed to a bad moral act, is an expression of virtue and not an expression of vice. Now, I want to then move on to this question of then how do we integrate all of this together? how do we integrate the ilm with the amal and see how justice arises out of that. And this again is, if we want to see how this is emanating from the walaya of the Imam, then one of the ways in which we could see it is maybe from snapshots of what it is that we in particular can learn from Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And there are a number of things which are very clear, and they relate to the three types of doing justice: to the self, to God, and to the other. One simple element here, which is often neglected, is not just what is explicitly said, but then what is also conveyed through certain words, for example, words of supplication, dua. A lot of us, of course, recite these ad'iyah, these du'as, which are narrated from the Ahlul Bayt, and particularly the one which is associated with Imam Hussein is the dua of the day of Arafah, which passed a few weeks ago. And sometimes what happens is we do not necessarily pay attention to what is actually being said, and understand that the dua actually conveys theological meaning, but also conveys spiritual and moral teachings. And that's one of the ways we can understand it, because it allows us to be just to ourselves by understanding what our situation is, our utter insignificance almost in the wider cosmos with respect to be standing before God, but also of being just to oneself by recognizing that the rank of being an abd, of being a servant or a slave of God, is a very high rank. So one has to break one's self, break one's animal desires and animality, acknowledge one's sin, acknowledge one's inadequacy, which is there in the du'as, especially in that one, so that we can allow the ubudiyat to emerge. There are many others. There are the ways in which the doing of justice to others is enacted. For example, the way in which the Imam behaved to others, the pure self-giving, the way in which, for example, he famously deals with Hur and his contingent who comes to stop him and gives him water freely, the way in which then his son Imam Sajjad deals with the others, then how he writes about it in the famous Wasat al-Huquq, which again is very much a neglected text of our tradition. And other elements of the wider social sphere of justice, which one might call social justice, although I hesitate because of the way in which people normally understand social justice nowadays. And this is the fundamental notions around Amal bil Ma'ruf, so the famous statement of the Imam that his rising at this time is for Amal bil Ma'ruf, for commanding the good, and Nahi al Munkar. And, you know, in a sense, what could be more of a moral act or motivator precisely than Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi al Munkar, and to bring about an equilibrium within society which has become too materialistic, has lost sight of the way in which value is ascribed to individuals, to character, to events, to holdings, to properties, and so forth. And the ultimate expression of that, there's 2 points which I'll kind of wrap up with before I say something more about the contemporary world, is arriving at justice of oneself and with respect to God through the statements, through the stations of what one might call rida, pleasure, contentment, and itminan. Yes, so I was talking about how it is that we understand the relationship of how justice arises, and we can look at elements from the life and the behavior of the Imam himself in Karbala to make sense of that. One final point I want to make here is um, an interesting one about how do you go beyond justice, or how, in a sense, do you sometimes forego justice? And this is already indicated in the Quran. The Quran in certain places talks about justice as a kind of requital for something, but that one can forego it if one's desire is for love and benevolence. Love is greater, and this again is something that we can find in the accounts of Karbala. Um, Justice, for example, would require a simple requital. Love is something that takes you beyond. It's the way in which the Imam, in its ever super abundant goodness, deals with those who are around him, and how the question of requital is to a large extent deferred. And even when we talk about the requital or the vengeance, for example, we have this stuff about Tha'at Allah and the Imam of our time as avenging the blood of the Imam. I think sometimes we can be a bit too literalistic about, or too literalist about understanding what that might entail. It's not just about the question of blood, but the most proper requital is precisely to go beyond in terms of love and bring about a state of being which is in harmony with that cosmic adalat. That is the fundamental vengeance. It's not necessarily the specific details. It doesn't mean that one is true and the other one is not, but rather it's quite clear that a deeper understanding of what is entailed in the vengeance, the true vengeance is to bring about an order which is contrary to the one which led to the murder, the merciless murder of the Imam on the plains of Karbala. Now, just a final word about what this entails, perhaps for the sorts of ways in which we think about social justice today. And perhaps here we need to understand, we need to just pay attention to some sorts of relationships. First of all, we shouldn't just be concerned with justice as a process, for example, a legal process, but rather we should be much more concerned with justice as something which is done, and as I said, that is what is done is very much this complementarity between the ilm and the amal, complementarity between the ontology and what ought to be. The second point I would make is that distributive justice is one thing, but one should actually be thinking about how we go beyond that and particularly look at what you might call corrective or even reparative justice. This is quite important in terms of the world in which we're living today, precisely because a lot of what is going on in terms of discrimination, in terms of the inequalities of life, inequalities of opportunity, inequality of treatment that we see around the world, doesn't just require a better distribution of social goods, but also requires a reparation for that, going beyond that. And that is a reparation which is not just in the simple sense of repairing by, for example, giving money or by compensating. But it's actually much more than that. It's about repairing minds, repairing psychology, repairing a way in which you look at the world, which has to be fundamentally recompensed. It's not just about financial matters. And this is why this issue of reparative justice is absolutely essential to that. This is why, in a sense, I'm very much in favor in academic contexts for decolonization, precisely because it is not just about the distribution, but it's also about the reparation. And the final point I would make here is that when we're talking about justice, yes, we are talking about the way in which we deal with each other, and for which we can take much from the lessons of Karbala. But we also want to insert within that divine justice. And the way in which we insert divine justice in that, again, it will lead us back to that link to the Walaya of the Imam. Because it's the Walaya, as I was mentioning yesterday, which constitutes the totality of the divine names, expression of the totality of the divine names, expression of divine justice itself. And so if we attach our ethical framework and the justice which arises out of that to the Walaya of the Imam, then we will pay far more attention to how our agency arises out of divine justice, and works in the way in which we can understand the cosmos, the world in which we live, as a sacred space, as very much a space in which we are constantly aware of the presence of the divine, and then we see the face of the divine in everything that we do, which in many ways is triggered by the way in which we see the face of the divine as it's manifest on the plains of Karbala. And with that, I think I will stop, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rizvi. We go quickly toward the questions. I know because it's very early morning, almost there, like 3:30 a.m. there. So
3:40.
Yeah. So the first question is, as you said, the quadruple moral psychology of aql, wahm, ghazab, shahwat does not apply to God. On the other hand, we are encouraged to resemble God in moral virtues. Can you please elaborate on how Muslim moral philosophers reconcile the two? Thanks.
Yeah, so that's precisely the notion that there's two elements of us. There is kind of as the poets say, there is the Nuri and the Nari, right? There is the animality of us, but there's also that which takes us beyond that. And the element of what is Nuri, or what takes you beyond the animality, precisely is the rational soul, or the intellect itself. And it's through the perfection of the intellect, through the perfection of the both the theoretical and the practical intellect, where one's act of theosis arises, right? And then, of course, when one does that, then we see that animality being expressed in the way in which we behave. Now, of course, we can understand how that interface of the divine and the animal, in a sense, works, because we already see that in the moral exemplars, which I was talking about yesterday and today. So we see that in the way in which the Ahlul Bayt express that. They are human, they are people of flesh and blood who are acting within bodies, within this particular world, but they are also the way in which we can understand what the divine names themselves mean. So that's usually the way in which that that kind of supposing contradiction or coincidencia oppositorium, if you want to call it, works out. And as I said, it's not actually just the animality or the elements of the animality of the faculties of motivation which can be a problem ethically or speaking, or certainly for enacting justice, but also the intellect itself, if it is not perfected. The intellect can itself be the greatest fail before a person.
Thank you so much. The second question, you talked about the distinction between Jahl Asid and Jahl Murakkab. can we find the distinction in the Quran? If yes, how does the Quran express or describe the two types of jahl? In other words, what is the Quranic language in talking about them? If you have on top of it.
Yeah, to be honest, I can't remember the exact words, but it strikes me as being, constantly the Quran talks about people just not being aware of the fact that they are not aware. And I guess one of the parables which expresses that, both the absolute level of knowledge and then the absolute level of ignorance, is the parable of the light verse and the verses which come after it. So you have the light verse, which talks about light. God is the light of heaven and the earth. And then the verses after, which talk about the person who is in dark and is in such great darkness that they are not even capable of seeing their hand, right, or seeing themselves. And so the question arises about whether they're even necessarily aware of the fact that they are in darkness. So in some ways that precisely is this notion of Jahal Murakkab. It's not just that you do not know, but it's also you're not aware of and do not know that you do not know. I'm sure there are many, many other examples, but that's the one which first comes to mind.
Yeah, thank you so much. The third question.
But again, that's the sort of question you need to ask a mullah, because they tend to know these texts better than I do.
Yeah, of course. So the third question, which would be the last question, would be how do you explain or justify what happened to Imam Hussein from the point of view of divine justice? You talked about social justice too, but
yeah,
the divine side.
So this is the classic kind of problem of evil, right? And there's many different ways in which one can understand it. We can look at it in terms of a wider history of, for example, the way in which Walaya works out in the cosmos. We can understand it in terms of the wider history of sacrifice. And that ultimately these things, sacrifice is there so that it has an impact upon us, so that we can understand how we ought to behave, right? So one of the fundamental features of the Imam and the Ahlul Bayt is guidance to help us understand what things like sacrifice mean and how we should act appropriately. So it's not just the fact that God allows this to happen, and even the Imam, in a sense, you could say, allows it to happen to him, but rather that it exists within a wider context of sacrifice. And the whole issue of sacrifice, of course, the Qurban, in a sense, would require much more discussion. But it's also that fundamentally, it is not the case that everything that we do and everything that happens in the cosmos is the direct kind of causal act of God, constantly kind of doing things, impelling you to do certain things and not do certain other things. We ultimately do have freedom. We ultimately do have the freedom to make those particular choices and act in a particular way. Perhaps the question is, how would we understand a world in which what happened in Karbala worked out in a different manner? So there would, of course, be a knock-on effect in all sorts of ways. But if you look at it in the wider context, how do we understand the fact, the kind of, in a sense, the historical fact that the truth is constantly being hidden? The light which is in front of people is constantly being covered. And how that presents a certain element of the bala, which I talked about yesterday, which is presented to humans. So all of us have these trials which are set before us, including, of course, the Ahlul Bayt. They have those trials set before them as well. But the trials, the way in which they perhaps deal with the trials are perhaps not the way in which we deal with them. But it has to be allowed to happen so that we can then make the sorts of choices that are before us. so that we can then decide whether we want to be shakir or whether we want to be kafir. So it's a kind of it's a package of lots of other issues which will relate to this fundamental question of theodicy. It's the same thing you could say, you know, why does God allow Amir al-Mu'mineen to be martyred in Kufa? Why does you know, he allow certain things to happen in the final days of the Prophet's life and after that, and in many other contexts? Why does he allow tsunamis to happen and so forth? In many ways, it's the similar sorts of questions which relate to it, and that there has to be a sense in which justice is an ideal to which we aspire. We have to be aspirational. That's what being aspirational is, one of the ways in which we help ourselves to realize what it means to be human.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rizvi, for the time that you put out and for us, and we appreciate for having the speech for tonight. And we start the part of the morning ritual side, and we will say like goodbye to you, but still you can be with us, depending on your choice. So thank you so much.